The sun hung like a copper coin against the bleached New Mexico sky, casting long shadows across the red rock wasteland that stretched beyond the horizon. Beau McAllister pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes, the scar beneath his left eye catching the harsh light like a pale lightning bolt frozen in time. 10 years of desert wind had carved lines into his face, each one a story of loss, of searching, of nights spent staring at stars that offered no answers. Dusty, his palomino, gelding, moved with the easy rhythm of a horse who knew these trails better than most men knew their own names. The animal's golden coat gleamed despite the dust that seemed to coat everything in this godforsaken corner of the territory. His ears swiveled constantly, alert to every sound that carried on the desert wind, the distant cry of a hawk, the rattle of stones dislodged by unseen creatures, the whisper of sage brush against the canyon walls. They'd been tracking the Martinez family's stray heifer for the better part of 3 hours, following hoofprints that led deeper into the maze of canyons locals called Las Garras del Diablo. Devil's Claws, the name fit. These twisted passages of stone seemed designed to swallow men whole, to hide secrets in their shadowed depths. During the war, Confederate raiders had used these canyons to ambush Union supply trains. The bones of both sides still littered the hidden draws, picked clean by vultures and time. "Easy, boy," Beau murmured as Dusty's pace began to slow. They'd reached a narrow gorge where the walls rose like cathedral spires on either side, their red faces streaked with black mineral stains that looked like old blood. The trail here was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, with loose shale that clicked and scattered with each step. But Dusty had stopped entirely now. His head raised, nostrils flared. His whole body had gone tense, muscles coiled like springs. Beneath his hide, "What is it?" Beau asked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. He'd learned long ago to trust his horse's instincts. Dusty had saved his life more times than he cared to count, alerting him to Apache war parties, warning him away from poisoned waterholes. Sensing the approach of flash floods before the first drops of rain fell, the horse took a step backward, then another. His hooves rang against the stone like hammer blows. When Beau tried to urge him forward with gentle pressure from his knees, Dusty planted his feet and refused to budge. "Come on, boy." That heifer could be just around the bend. But Dusty lowered his head and snorted, the sound sharp and urgent in the canyon silence. Then he did something that made Beau's blood run cold. The horse began to circle, his movements tight and agitated, as if something in the canyon ahead filled him with dread. Beau had seen Dusty face down mountain lions without flinching. He'd carried Beau through Apache territory where the very air seemed to hum with danger. But whatever lay ahead in that narrow passage had the palomino spooked worse than Beau had ever seen him. All right, Beau said, dismounting and taking the reins. "We'll go on foot." But when he tried to lead Dusty forward, the horse reared back so violently that the reins were nearly torn from Beau's grip. Dusty's eyes showed white around the edges, and his breathing came in sharp, frightened huffs. That's when Beau heard a sound so faint it might have been the wind, but different, human, a voice, weak and desperate, calling from somewhere, deep in the canyon's shadows. Beau left Dusty at the mouth of the passage, the horse still trembling but calmer, now that distance separated him from whatever lay ahead. He checked his Colt .45, making sure it moved freely in its holster, then picked his way carefully over the loose stones. The canyon narrowed even further as he advanced, the walls pressing in like giant hands. Overhead, the strip of sky had shrunk to a ribbon of blue, and the shadows were so deep that high noon felt like twilight. Every footstep seemed to echo for eternity, and Beau found himself moving with the exaggerated care of a man who expected an ambush at any moment. The voice came. Again, definitely human, definitely female, and so weak it was barely more than a whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the canyon walls until he couldn't tell its direction. "Hello?" he called out, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. "Where are you?" The response was so faint he almost missed it. "Help ... Please ... double quotes." Beau rounded a bend in the passage and stopped dead. The canyon opened into a small amphitheater of stone, its walls rising in terraced ledges like some ancient coliseum. But it wasn't the dramatic scenery that froze him in place. It was what he saw at the base of the far wall. A girl, barely more than a child, was chained to a flat slab of sandstone. Her clothes were little more than rags, her dark hair matted with dirt and sweat. She was painfully thin, her skin burned dark by the sun, except where the chains had rubbed her wrists raw. She couldn't have been more than 15 or 16, but her eyes held the hollow, haunted look of someone who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. Beau approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel-strewn floor of the natural amphitheater. Up close, he could see that the chains were heavy iron, secured with military-grade locks, not the work of some casual desperado, but someone with resources and planning. "Easy now," he said, his voice gentle as he might use with a spooked horse. "I'm here to help." The girl's eyes tracked his movement, but she didn't speak. There was recognition there, and something else, a wariness so deep it had become instinct. "What's your name?" Beau asked, kneeling beside her and examining the chains. They were new, the iron still showing the marks of a blacksmith's hammer. "Mariah," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Well, Mariah, I'm going to get you out of here. But I need to know who did this to you." She closed her eyes, and for a moment, Beau thought she might have fainted. But then she spoke, her words carrying the weight of terrible certainty. "He'll come back. He always comes back." Beau studied the locks, cursing under his breath. They were built to last, and he didn't have the tools to pick them. He'd have to shoot them off, but that carried its own risks. The ricochets in this stone bowl could be deadly. "Who's coming back, Mariah? What's his name?" "Rowe," she breathed. "Jed Rowe." The name hit Beau like a physical blow. He'd heard it, whispered in saloons from Colorado to the Mexican border, a former lawman turned outlaw, running everything from cattle rustling to worse, much worse. There were stories about children who disappeared from frontier towns, about a trade route that stretched south into Mexico, where questions weren't asked and money talked louder than morality. "How long have you been here?" 3 days. "Maybe?" 4. Hard to tell. Beau positioned his Colt carefully, aiming at the chain link closest to the rock. "Cover your face," he said. The shot rang out like thunder in the enclosed space, the sound bouncing back and forth between the walls until it seemed like a whole company of soldiers was firing at once. The chain parted with a sharp crack, and Mariah's left arm fell free. As Beau moved to position himself for the second shot, something caught his eye, a glint of silver at the girl's throat. She wore a locket on a thin chain, and even through the grime and tarnish, he could see its distinctive shape. His breath caught in his throat. It was identical to the one he'd given his sister Sarah for her 16th birthday, 2 months before the bandits came and burned their family farm to the ground. Sarah had been wearing it when they took her, and Beau had spent the last 10 years wondering if he'd ever see it again. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Mariah's hand moved protectively to her throat. "It was my mother's. She gave it to me before she died." "What was your mother's name?" "Sarah Chun." She stopped, her eyes widening with recognition. "McAllister. Her name was Sarah McAllister, before she married." The second gunshot echoed through the canyon, but Beau barely heard it. The world had narrowed to this moment, this impossible convergence of past and present. This girl, this child he'd found chained to a rock in the middle of nowhere, was Sarah's daughter. His niece, the family he'd thought was lost forever, Mariah, rubbed her freed wrists, wincing as the circulation returned to her hands. Beau helped her to her feet, and she swayed like a sapling in a strong wind. When was the last time she'd had water? Food? Can you walk? He asked. She nodded, but her first step nearly sent her tumbling. Beau caught her arm, steadying her against his side. Easy, we'll take it slow. But even as he spoke, he was thinking about what came next. If Jed Rowe was involved, this wasn't some random kidnapping. The man was smart, organized, and ruthless. He wouldn't have left a valuable piece of his operation unguarded for long. Mariah, listen to me. How many men does Rowe have with him? I don't know. I've seen maybe 4 or 5 different ones. They take turns watching the canyon. When did you last see them? This morning, early. They rode out together, said they had business in Rosario. That gave them maybe 6 hours before dark, when the night riders would return. Rosario was a hard day's ride south, but men like Rowe didn't keep regular schedules. They could be back any time. They made their way slowly back through the narrow passage, Mariah leaning heavily on Beau's arm. Every few steps, she had to stop and catch her breath, and he could feel her trembling with exhaustion and shock. When they reached the mouth of the canyon, Dusty whickered softly and approached them. With cautious steps. The horse's ears were still pinned back, but he seemed to understand that the immediate danger had passed. Easy, boy, Beau murmured, reaching out to stroke the Palomino's neck. You were right to be scared. To his surprise, Dusty stretched his neck toward Mariah, sniffing at her cautiously. She raised her free hand, and the horse allowed her to touch his muzzle, a sign of acceptance that would have meant nothing to most people, but spoke volumes to someone who understood horses. He's beautiful, Mariah whispered. What's his name? Dusty, and he's got better judgment than most men I've known. Beau was about to help Mariah into the saddle when the sound reached them hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. Not the steady rhythm of a single horse, but the staccato beat of multiple riders moving fast. Dusty's head shot up, and his whole body went rigid. The message was clear. Danger, coming fast. Up, Beau said urgently, boosting Mariah onto Dusty's back. But there wasn't time to mount behind her. The hoofbeats were getting closer, and in these narrow passages, they'd be sitting ducks if they were caught in the open. Can you ride? He asked. Mariah nodded, gathering the reins with hands that shook but held steady. Follow this trail north until you reach the main road. Don't stop for anything. If something happens to me, find the sheriff in Rosario and tell him about Rowe. I'm not leaving you. The hoofbeats were very close now. 2 riders, maybe 3, moving through the maze of stone passages with the confidence of men who knew every twist and turn. Beau drew his Colt and checked the cylinder. 4 shots left, and he had a dozen more rounds on his gun belt. It would have to be enough. Go, he said, now. But before Mariah could kick Dusty into motion, the first rider appeared around the benda, lean man with a silver star pinned to his vest and cold blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Behind him came another rider, younger and meaner looking, with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. Well, well, the first man said, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl. Looks like we got ourselves a hero. Beau kept his gun trained on the man's chest. Jed Rowe, I presume. Former Sheriff Jed Rowe, if you want to be formal about it. Rowe's hand rested casually on the butt of his own pistol, but he made no move to draw. Not yet, and you've got something that belongs to me. She doesn't belong to anybody. Rowe laughed, a sound like gravel scraping on stone. You got no idea what you've stepped into, friend. That girl there represents a considerable investment. People are expecting delivery. Then they're going to be disappointed. The scarred rider was edging his horse to the left, trying to get an angle on Beau without endangering Roe. Standard outlaw tactics. Keep talking while your partner gets into position. You know, Roe continued conversationally, there's an easier way to handle this. You ride on out of here, forget what you've seen, and everybody goes home happy. Well, everybody except the girl, but she was never going home anyway. Not happening. I figured you'd say that. Roe's hand moved toward his gun. Shame, really. Hate to waste good horse flesh. The gunfight that followed lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it unfolded with the strange clarity that comes in moments of mortal danger. Roe went for his gun first, fast and smooth, but Beau was already moving. His first shot took the outlaw leader high in the shoulder, spinning him around in his saddle. The scarred rider got his gun clear first, but Dusty chose that moment to rear up on his hind legs, pawing the air with his front hooves. The sudden movement spooked the rider's horse, and his shot went wide, chipping stone from the canyon wall. Beau's second shot didn't miss, but there was a third rider, one they hadn't seen, positioned on a ledge above the canyon mouth. His rifle cracked like a whip, and Beau felt the bullet tug at his shirt as it passed. He dove for cover behind a fallen boulder, but the angle was all wrong. The sniper had them pinned down, and it was only a matter of time before he found his mark. That's when salvation came from an unexpected direction. The rifle shot that dropped the sniper didn't come from Beau's position. It came from high above, from a concealed position among the rocks where someone had been waiting and watching. Stay down. A woman's voice called out. Not young, but steady and sure. Beau kept his head low and his gun ready as footsteps approached. This careful, measured steps of someone who knew how to move quietly over loose stone. When he finally looked up, he saw a woman in her 60s, silver-haired and sun-weathered, carrying a Henry rifle with the casual competence of someone who'd been shooting since childhood. Mrs. Langley? He said, recognizing her from the general. Store in Rosario. Afternoon, Mr. McAllister. She glanced at Jed Roe, who was slumped over his saddle, clutching his wounded shoulder. Figured you might need some help. How did you know you were here? She smiled grimly. Let's just say I keep an eye on things, especially when it comes to Jed Roe and his ... business interests. Roe was still alive, though bleeding freely and pale with shock. The scarred rider wasn't moving, and the sniper on the ledge had gone silent after Mrs. Langley's shot. We need to get the girl to a doctor, Beau said. Mrs. Langley moved to Dusty's side, looking up at Mariah with the same assessing gaze she might use to evaluate livestock at market. But there was kindness there, too, the instinctive protectiveness of a woman who understood what the girl had endured. Can you ride a little further, child? Mariah nodded weakly. She was still upright in the saddle, but Beau could see the exhaustion catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. There's a line shack about 2 miles north, Mrs. Langley said. We can rest there while we figure out what comes next. As they prepared to move out, Beau found himself watching the interplay between Dusty and Mariah. The horse had accepted her presence completely, responding to her touch and voice as if they'd been partners for years rather than minutes. There was something deeper there, a recognition that went beyond the normal bond between human and animal. Roe groaned and tried to straighten up in his saddle. You ... You people don't know what you're doing. There are others. They'll come looking. Let them come, Mrs. Langley said calmly. I've been waiting for this reckoning for a long time. As they rode north through the maze of canyons, Mrs. Langley told her story in short, clipped sentences. She'd been a schoolteacher once in a little town called Harmony Springs. That was before Roe's men came through, before children started disappearing in the night. Lost 3 students that spring, she said. Good kids. Their families never. Found so much as a trace. Why didn't you go to the law? She gave him a look that could have melted steel. Roe was the law. Had a badge and everything. Who were we supposed to report him to himself? The line shack was exactly what its name suggested, a crude shelter built, where the boundary lines of several ranches converged. It was constructed of rough-hewn logs and roofed with sod, more like a cave than a house. But it had 4 walls and a roof, and right now that felt like luxury. Beau helped Mariah down from Dusty's back, catching her when her knees buckled. She was running on pure will at this point, and that well was almost dry. Inside the shack, Mrs. Langley produced supplies. From her saddlebags, with the efficiency of someone who'd planned for this contingency. Water, hardtack, jerky, and a bottle of laudanum for Mariah's pain. Drink this, she said, offering Mariah a cup of water. Slowly now. Your stomach's not used to much. While Mrs. Langley tended to Mariah, Beau secured Jed Roe to one of the support posts with rope from his saddle. The wound in the outlaw's shoulder needed attention too. They couldn't let him bleed to death before he faced justice. But Beau wasn't feeling particularly charitable at the moment. Tell me about the others, he said, crouching down so he was. At eye level with Roe. How many men are we dealing with? Roe spat blood and glared at him. Go to hell. I've been there already. Your turn's coming. Beau's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. You can tell me now, or you can tell the federal marshals later. Either way, we're going to shut down your operation. You think this is about one girl? Roe laughed bitterly. This is bigger than you can imagine. There are people and places. You never heard of who pay good money for what we provide. You think killing me is going to stop that? Maybe not. But it's a start. As evening approached and the canyon walls began to purple with shadow, Beau found himself standing outside the shack, watching Dusty graze on the sparse grass that grew near a tiny seep spring. The horse seemed calm now, but alert ears constantly swiveling, nostrils testing the wind for scents that might signal danger. Behind him, he could hear Mrs. Langley's voice, low and soothing, as she talked with Mariah. There were things that needed to be said, stories that needed to be shared, but some conversations could only happen between women who understood what it meant to survive in a world that saw them as prey. It was full dark when Mariah finally emerged from the shack. She moved more steadily now, though she still looked fragile as spun glass. Mrs. Langley told me, she said without preamble, about my mother, about what happened to your family. Beau nodded. He'd expected this conversation, but that didn't make it any easier. She used to talk about you, Mariah continued, when I was little. She said you were the best man she'd ever known, and that someday you'd come looking for us. I tried, God knows I tried, but the trail went cold, and you found me. Her voice was steady, but there were tears on her cheeks. When it mattered most, you found me. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night. Sounds of the canyon, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of wind through sage, the soft sound of Dusty's hooves on stone as he wandered in slow circles around the camp. What happens now? Mariah asked. Now we take Roe to the authorities. Real authorities, federal marshals, who can't be bought or intimidated. And then ... double quotes. Beau paused, uncertain. He'd been alone for so long that the idea of family, of responsibility for another person, felt foreign and frightening. And then we figure out what comes next, he finished. They set out for Rosario at first light, a strange procession making its way through the red rock wilderness. Beau led the way on foot, leading Dusty, who carried both Mariah and their supplies. Mrs. Langley followed on her own mount, keeping watch behind them. Jed Rowe brought up the rear, his hands tied to his saddle horn, his wounded shoulder roughly bandaged, but still seeping blood through his shirt. The outlaw leader had been silent since dawn, but Beau could feel his eyes boring holes in his back. Men like Rowe didn't give up easily, and even wounded and captured, he remained dangerous. It would be a mistake to underestimate him. As they emerged from the canyon country onto the broader desert floor, the landscape opened up into rolling hills covered with mesquite and prickly pear. In the distance, dust devils danced across the hardpan like ghostly tornadoes, and turkey vultures wheeled in lazy circles overhead. How much farther? Mariah asked. The night's rest had restored some of her strength, but the desert sun was already beginning to take its toll. Maybe 3 hours, Beau replied. There's a water hole about halfway. We'll rest there. But they never made it to the water hole. The attack came from their left flank, from a cluster of weathered boulders that provided perfect cover for riflemen. The first shot kicked up dust near Dusty's hooves, and the second shattered Mrs. Langley's. Rifle stock, down! Beau shouted, pulling Mariah from the saddle and rolling with her behind a low rise in the ground. 4 riders emerged from concealment, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they charged. These weren't the desperate men who'd held Mariah captive. These were professionals, well-armed and well-mounted, with the coordinated movements of a military unit. Rowe's insurance policy, Mrs. Langley said grimly, pressing herself flat against the earth as bullets whined overhead. She'd drawn a revolver to replace her damaged rifle, but the range was too great for accurate pistol work. Beau counted his ammunition 6 shots in his Colt, plus the rifle in his saddle boot. But Dusty had bolted when the shooting started, and the rifle might as well have been on the moon. The riders were closing fast, whooping and firing as they came. In another minute, they'd be close enough that marksmanship wouldn't matter. They could simply ride down the small party and finish them at point-blank range. That's when Mariah did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She whistled, sharp, piercing sound that cut through the gunfire like a blade. Dusty, who'd been running in panic across the desert floor, stopped as if he'd hit an invisible wall. His head came up, ears pricked forward, and for a moment it seemed to stretch forever. Horse and girl stared at each other across the battlefield. Then, Dusty was moving again, but not away from the fight. He was running toward it, toward Mariah, with a kind of desperate courage that only comes from absolute love and trust. "What are you doing?" Beau shouted. But Mariah was already moving, running toward the charging horse in a move that should have been suicidal. One of the attacking riders saw her and turned his rifle in her direction, but his shot went wide as his horse stumbled on the uneven ground. Dusty reached Mariah at full gallop, and she grabbed his mane and swung up onto his. Back in one fluid motion, a feat that would have been impressive for an experienced rider, miraculous for a half-starved girl who'd spent the last week chained to a rock. But she wasn't done surprising them. Instead of fleeing to safety, Mariah turned Dusty toward the attackers, and suddenly the roles were reversed. The hunters became the hunted as 800 pounds of angry Palomino bore down on them like a golden avalanche. The first rider's horse shied away from the collision, throwing off his aim. The second rider got his shot off, but Dusty was moving at an angle, weaving like a prizefighter, and the bullet passed harmlessly behind them. Then they were in the middle of the enemy formation, and chaos reigned. Horses collided and riders shouted in confusion. One man went down when Dusty struck his mount with a front hoof, and another fell when his horse stumbled trying to avoid the melee. In the confusion, Beau found his opening. He put 2 shots into the nearest rider, dropping him from his saddle. Mrs. Langley's revolver barked twice, and a third attacker clutched his arm and wheeled his horse away from the fight. The fourth rider, their leader, judging by his elaborate, silver-studded gun belt, managed to get clear of the confusion and draw a bead on Mariah. But before he could fire, another horse and rider materialized out of nowhere. Jed Rowe, his hands still tied, but his wounded shoulder forgotten, had managed to guide his horse into the fray using only his knees and his voice. The collision between the two horses was tremendous, both animals going down in a tangle of legs and screams. Rowe's motivation wasn't hard to understand. If his men killed Mariah, they'd have no reason to keep him alive. Better to join the fight and hope for the best. When the dust settled, 3 of the attackers were dead. 1 was wounded and fleeing across the desert, and Jed Rowe was trapped under his fallen horse with what looked like a broken leg to add to his other injuries. Mariah slid down from Dusty's back, her face pale, but her eyes bright with the kind of fierce joy that comes from surviving the impossible. The horse nuzzled her gently, as if checking to make sure she was unharmed. "That," said Mrs. Langley, reloading her revolver with steady hands, "was either the bravest thing I've ever seen, or the stupidest." "Maybe both," Mariah replied, stroking Dusty's neck. "But it worked." They reached Rosario just as the sun was setting, painting the adobe buildings the color of dried blood. The town was larger than Beau had expected, maybe 300 souls, with a proper church, a school, and even a small newspaper office. But it was the federal marshal's office that interested him most, the wooden sign hanging crookedly beside a heavy oak door. Marshal Tom Bradley was a competent-looking man in his 40s, with iron-gray hair and the kind of steady demeanor that suggested he'd seen most everything the frontier had to offer and wasn't easily impressed. But his eyebrows rose when they carried Jed Rowe into his office, and they rose even higher when Beau began to explain what they'd discovered in the canyons. "Child trafficking," the marshal repeated slowly. "You're sure about this?" "Dead sure," Mrs. Langley said. "I've been tracking Rowe's operation for 2 years. He's got a network that stretches from Colorado to the Mexican border, uses abandoned mining camps and old stage stations as way stops." Bradley turned to study Jed Rowe, who was propped up in a chair with his broken leg splinted and his shoulder freshly bandaged by the town doctor. The outlaw leader met his gaze without flinching, but there was something desperate in his eyes now, the look of a man who could see the gallows in his future. "What do you have to say about these accusations, Jed?" "It's all lies," Rowe said, but his voice lacked conviction. "These people are trying to frame me. That girl there, she's probably in on it. You can't trust anything she says." Mariah stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance. She'd cleaned up at the town's bathhouse and put on clothes donated by the minister's wife, but there was still something wild and fierce about her, a survivor's steel that no amount of abuse could break. "Ask him about the other children," she said. "Ask him about the ranch in Mexico where buyers come to shop. Ask him about the mine shaft where they keep the ones who fight back." Rowe's face went pale. "She's lying." "Ask him about Sarah McAllister," Beau said quietly. "Ask him how she died trying to escape with her baby." This time, Rowe's composure cracked completely. That ... That wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to run. If she'd just stayed put, cooperated like the others ... "So you admit you had her?" Bradley's voice was sharp now, all business. "I admit nothing. She came to us willingly. Said she needed money, wanted to make a new life in Mexico." "With her infant daughter?" Mrs. Langley's voice was ice cold. "What kind of new life were you offering, Jed?" The silence stretched out until Rowe finally broke. "It wasn't my idea. The whole thing, it was bigger than me. There were people involved, important people, who needed ... who wanted." He stopped, perhaps realizing that every word was another nail in his coffin. Marshal Bradley stood up and walked to his desk, pulling out a wanted poster from a thick stack of papers. "Jed Rowe," he read aloud, "wanted by federal authorities for kidnapping, human trafficking, murder, and conspiracy. Reward, $5,000, dead or alive. He turned to face the group. Folks, I've been trying to catch this man for 3 years. If what you're telling me is true, you've done the territory a considerable service. Over the next 2 hours, they gave their statements while a deputy scribbled notes and Marshal Bradley asked probing questions. The story that emerged was even worse than Beau had imagined. A network of corruption and cruelty that stretched across multiple territories, with buyers and sellers operating with near impunity. But it was also a story of courage and survival, of a young woman who died protecting her child, and a horse who'd somehow known that this particular girl needed rescuing. As the evening wore on, Mariah found herself growing tired again. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the day was wearing off, leaving her drained and hollow-eyed. "Where will you go now?" Marshal Bradley asked her. "Do you have family? People who can take care of you?" Mariah looked at Beau, and he saw his sister's eyes staring back at him, the same green eyes that had watched him from across the breakfast table every morning of his childhood. "She has family," he said. "She has me." But Mrs. Langley had other ideas. "Marshal, I'd like to petition the court to become this girl's legal guardian." Everyone stared at her in surprise. "Now, Edith," Bradley said carefully, "that's mighty generous of you, but I'm not being generous. I'm being practical." Her voice was brisk, businesslike. "Mr. McAllister is a good man, but he's a drifter. A cowboy. What does he know about raising a young lady? About schooling and proper clothes and all the things a girl needs?" Beau felt a stab of hurt, followed immediately by the recognition that she was right. What did he know about raising a child? His own childhood had ended when he was barely older than Mariah was now. "Besides," Mrs. Langley continued, "I have something he doesn't: a house, a steady income, and 20 years of experience as a teacher. I can give her stability, education, a chance at a normal life." "And what about Mr. McAllister?" Bradley asked. "Does he have any say in this?" All eyes turned to Beau. He looked at Mariah, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Hope? Fear? Resignation? "I think," he said slowly, "that we should ask Mariah what she wants." The next morning found them at the town cemetery, standing before a simple wooden cross that marked an unmarked grave. Marshal Bradley had told them about it: a young woman found dead in the desert 3 years ago, clutching an infant's blanket, but no child. The description matched Sarah perfectly: the auburn hair, the green eyes, the small scar on her left hand from a childhood accident with their father's plow. "Sarah always said she wanted to see the ocean," Beau said quietly, placing a handful of desert wildflowers at the base of the cross. "Said she'd heard it was blue as the sky on a clear day, and twice as big." Mariah knelt beside the grave, her fingers tracing the weathered wood. "She used to tell me stories about you, about how you'd take her fishing at the creek behind your house, and how you taught her to ride bareback when she was 7. She was fearless on a horse, just like someone else I know." They stood in the morning stillness, 3 people bound together by loss and circumstance, while Dusty grazed peacefully nearby. The Palomino had refused to be stabled overnight, preferring to stand watch outside the boarding house where they'd taken rooms. Even now, his ears swiveled constantly, alert for any sound that might signal danger to his charges. Mrs. Langley broke the silence. "The offer still stands, you know, about taking her in. My house has plenty of room, and there's a good school here. She could have a normal life, friends her own age, books, music lessons if she wants them." Beau looked at Mariah, trying to read the expression in those familiar green eyes. "What do you think?" "I think," she said carefully, "that I've learned not to trust easy answers. Mrs. Langley is kind and generous, and I'm grateful, but I've been on my own for a long time. I'm not sure I remember how to be somebody's ward. And I'm not sure I remember how to be somebody's guardian, Beau admitted. But maybe that's something we could figure out together. Mrs. Langley smiled. There's a third option, you know. Mr. McAllister, how do you feel about settling down? This territory needs good men who aren't afraid to stand up to people like Jed Rowe. What are you suggesting? The sheriff's job here is opening up come election time. Current man's getting too old for the work, and Marshal Bradley says he'd put in a good word for you. The pay's not much, but it comes with a house, and there'd be plenty of opportunities for someone with your particular skills. Beau felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of restlessness that had driven him west for 10 years. The idea of staying in one place, of having roots again, should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. Sheriff McAllister, he said, testing the sound of it. I suppose stranger things have happened, and I could still help with. Mariah's education, Mrs. Langley continued. Teach her the things she'd need to know, but she'd have family to go home to. They talked for another hour, working out the details of a future that none of them could have imagined a week before. Mariah would live with Beau, but spend her days with Mrs. Langley, learning not just reading and arithmetic, but all the social graces that might help her navigate a world that judged women by different standards than men as they prepared to leave. The cemetery, Mariah stopped beside Dusty and pressed her face against his neck. The horse stood perfectly still, as if he understood the weight of the moment. He saved my life, she said. When those men were shooting at us, and I climbed on his back, I don't know what made me think I could do that. I've never been much of a rider. Dusty's got good judgment about people, Beau said. Always has. If he trusted you enough to let you ride him into battle, and I reckon that says something important about who you are. They rode back toward town in comfortable silence, but as they crested the hill that gave them their first view of Rosario's adobe buildings, Dusty suddenly stopped and turned to look back at the canyon country they'd left behind. What is it, boy? Beau asked. The horse stood motionless for a long moment, his ears pricked forward, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. Then he whickered softly, not a sound of alarm, but something else. Recognition, maybe. Or farewell. For the next week, as they settled into their new life, Dusty continued his strange behavior. Every morning at dawn, he would leave his stall and make his way to the edge of town, always stopping at the same spot, a low rise that offered a clear view of the canyons. There he would stand for an hour or more, perfectly still, watching the red rocks in the distance. It's like he's keeping vigil, Mrs. Langley observed one morning, following Beau's gaze to where the Palomino stood silhouetted against the sunrise. Maybe he is. Horses remember things differently than we do. Places, people, they hold on to them in ways we don't understand. On the 7th morning, Mariah asked if she could join Dusty on his vigil. Beau watched from the porch of what would soon be their home as girl and horse stood together on the hill, two survivors sharing a moment of quiet communion with the ghosts of the past. When they returned, Mariah's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. I think he was saying goodbye. To my mother, maybe. To the canyon where he found me. To all the sadness we left back there. And are you ready to say goodbye too? She considered the question seriously, the way she seemed to approach everything with a gravity that made her seem older than her 16 years. I think I am. The past happened, and it's part of who I am. But it doesn't have to be all of who I am. That afternoon, Marshal Bradley swore Beau in his interim sheriff, the ceremony taking place on the steps of the courthouse with half the town in attendance. As he pinned the badge to Beau's vest, the marshal leaned close and spoke quietly. There's something you should know. Jed Rowe died this morning. Infection from that shoulder wound. He never did give us the names of his partners, but with him. Gone. The whole operation's likely to fall apart. Beau nodded. He felt no satisfaction at Roe's death, only a weary relief that justice had been served, even if not in the way they'd planned out. As the crowd dispersed and the sun began to set, Beau found himself standing once again on the porch of his new home, watching Dusty graze in the small corral behind the house. Mariah sat on the steps beside him, her hair freshly washed and braided, wearing a blue dress that Mrs. Langley had helped her pick out. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" she asked. "Staying here? Trying to build something new?" "I think," Beau said slowly, "that your mother would want us to try. She died trying to give you a chance at a better life. Seems to me the best way to honor that is to live that life as fully as we can." As if summoned by their conversation, Dusty raised his head and looked toward them. For a moment, the three of them, man, girl, and horse, formed a perfect tableau against the New Mexico sunset. Then the Palomino nickered softly and returned to his grazing, and Beau knew that whatever ghosts had been haunting them had finally found peace. The canyon country stretched endlessly beyond the town, red stone and shadow hiding 1,000 secrets. But they were secrets that belonged to the past now. The future lay here, in this dusty frontier town, in the promise of morning light and the steady rhythm of a horse's heartbeat and the slow, careful work of building a family from the scattered pieces of what came before. Mariah leaned against his shoulder, and Beau put his arm around her, his sister's daughter, his responsibility, his second chance at getting things right. "Tell me about the creek," she said. "The one where you end. Mama used to fish." And so he did, his voice carrying across the desert evening as the stars began to appear overhead and Dusty dozed peacefully in his corral, one ear always cocked toward the sound of family coming home to itself at last. 3 months later, Sheriff Beau McAllister sat astride Dusty on the same ridge where they'd first encountered the Devil's Claw Canyons. But this time, they weren't alone. Mariah rode beside him on a gentle mare named Whisper, a wedding gift from Mrs. Langley, who'd recently married the town's widowed doctor and couldn't keep all her horses. The transformation in Mariah had been remarkable. Under Mrs. Langley's patient tutelage, she'd learned to read and write with surprising speed, devouring books with the hunger of someone who'd been denied education for too long. But more than that, she'd learned to smile again, really smile. Not just the careful, guarded expression of someone perpetually ready to run or fight. "You still think about her, don't you?" Mariah said, following his gaze toward the canyon where they'd first found each other. "About Mama." "Every day," Beau admitted, "but it doesn't hurt the way it used to. Now, when I think about Sarah, I remember the good times teaching her to rope calves, listening to her laugh when she beat me at checkers. The last few years, all I could remember was losing her." Dusty shifted beneath him, ears pricked forward. The Palomino had filled out during their months in Rosario, his coat gleaming with health and regular grooming. But he hadn't lost his edge, if anything. His senses seemed sharper than ever, as if the responsibility of protecting not just Beau, but Mariah, as well had heightened his natural vigilance. "Marshal Bradley sent word yesterday," Beau said, changing the subject. "They rounded up the last of Roe's operation in Colorado. Found 12 children in a mining camp outside Denver. 12 kids who are going home to their families because of what you survived, what you remembered." Mariah nodded soberly. The nightmares had mostly stopped, but there were still moments when the weight of what she'd endured showed in her eyes. Mrs. Langley said it would take time, maybe years, for all the healing to happen. But every day brought small victories. Moments when the girl, Sarah's daughter, was meant to be shown through. A dust cloud on the horizon caught their attention. A single rider, moving fast across the desert floor toward town. Dusty's head came up, and he snorted softly, not alarm, but interest. "Expecting anyone?" Maria asked. Beau squinted against the afternoon sun, trying to make out details. The rider was still too far away to identify, but something about the way he sat his horse seemed familiar. They rode down to intercept the newcomer, meeting him at the crossroads just outside Rosario's limits. A man was young, maybe 25, with the lean build and weathered face of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. His horse was lathered with sweat, suggesting he'd been riding hard for some time. "You Sheriff McAllister?" "A rider asked, his voice tight with urgency. "That's right. What can I do for you?" "Name's Tom Fletcher. I ride for the Lazy S Ranch up in Colorado. We got a problem, and Marshal Bradley said you might be the man to help us with it." Beau waited, letting the man catch his breath and organize his thoughts. Kids been disappearing from the settlements north of Denver. 3 in the last month, all between 12 and 16, all vanished without a trace. Local sheriff thinks they're just runaways, but the families know better. Maria went very still in her saddle, and Beau saw her hands tighten on the reins. This was exactly the kind of news they'd been dreading. Confirmation that Roe's network had been bigger than they'd realized, with tentacles reaching far beyond what they'd uncovered. "What makes you think it's connected to the Roe business?" Beau asked. Fletcher reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a piece of paper, a wanted poster with a familiar face staring back at them. But it wasn't Jed Roe. This was a younger man with cold eyes and a thin scar running from his left temple to his jaw. "Marcus Roe," Fletcher said. "Yet's younger brother. He was up north when you took down the operation here. Now he's back, and he's picking up where his brother left off." Beau studied the poster, memorizing the face. "Any idea where he's holed up?" "That's the problem. He's smarter than Jed, maybe. Keeps moving, never stays in one place long. Enough for the law to catch up. But there's been talk about an old fort in the mountains, abandoned since the Indian Wars. Some of the traders say they've seen smoke coming from the chimneys." As Fletcher spoke, Beau found himself thinking about the choice ahead of them. They'd built something good here in Rosario, a home, a life, a chance for Maria to grow up safe and normal. Was he really prepared to risk all that, to chase another ghost across the wilderness? He looked at Maria and saw that she was thinking the same thing. But there was something else in her expression, a hardness that reminded him of her mother's stubborn determination. "Those kids," she said quietly, "they're going through what I went through. Maybe worse." "This isn't your fight," Beau said. "You've done enough, more than enough, isn't it?" She turned to face him fully, and he saw Sarah's fire burning in her green eyes. "How many more children have to disappear before someone stops these men? How many more families have to lose? Their daughters and sons?" Fletcher was watching this exchange with growing confusion, clearly not understanding the undercurrents of emotion flowing between them. But Beau understood perfectly. Maria wasn't just talking about other children. She was talking about redemption, about using their hard-won knowledge to prevent other families from experiencing the kind of loss they'd endured. "The territorial governor's offering a reward," Fletcher continued. $5,000 for Marcus Roe, dead or alive, plus expenses for anyone willing to track him down. $5,000. Enough to secure Maria's future, to pay for her education, to give her choices that most frontier girls never had. But money wasn't what was driving her. Beau could see that clearly enough. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "Can you stay in town overnight? Mrs. Langley runs a clean boarding house, and Doc Peterson can look at that horse of yours. Looks like he could use some rest." Fletcher nodded gratefully. "Much obliged, Sheriff. I'll be at the boarding house if you need me." As the young cowboy rode toward town, Beau and Maria sat their horses in silence, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon. Dusty pawed the ground restlessly, as if he sensed the weight of the decision ahead of them. "What are you thinking?" Beau asked. "I'm thinking about something Mrs. Langley told me last week. She said that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are afraid." "And what do you think is right?" Maria was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains where Marcus Rowe might be hiding with his latest victims. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and sure. "I think those children deserve the same chance I got. The chance to go home, to have a family, to not spend the rest of their lives wondering if the next stranger they meet is going to hurt them." That night, they held a family meeting around the kitchen table of their small house. Mrs. Langley and Doc Peterson had joined them, along with Marshal Bradley, who'd ridden down from the territorial capital to discuss Fletcher's report. Conversation was long and sometimes heated. Doc Peterson argued that they'd already done their share, that Maria needed stability and safety, not more exposure to violence and danger. Mrs. Langley worried about the practical aspects. Who would look after the town while Beau was gone? What would happen if something went wrong? How they could be sure this wasn't a trap. But Marshal Bradley brought news that changed everything. 3 more children had disappeared in the last week, including a 10-year-old boy from a ranch just 50 miles north of their position. "The trail's getting fresher," he said grimly. "But it's also getting more dangerous. Marcus Rowe knows. We're closing in, and desperate men do desperate things. All the more reason for someone with experience to handle this," Beau said. "Someone who understands how these operations work. And someone the children will trust," Maria added. "If they've been through what I went through, they're not going to trust strange men with badges. They're going to be scared, traumatized. They'll need someone who understands." In the end, it was Dusty who made the decision for them. As they talked late into the night, the Palomino began pacing in his corral, his hooves ringing against the wooden fence boards in an agitated rhythm. Finally, he let out a long, piercing whinny that cut through their conversation like a blade. "He knows," Maria said simply. "He knows we're needed." They left Rosario 3 days later, just as the first. Rays of dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold. Fletcher led the way on a fresh mount, while Beau and Maria followed on Dusty and Whisper. Mrs. Langley and Doc Peterson had agreed to look after the town in their absence, and Marshal Bradley had deputized 2 reliable men to help with the law enforcement duties. As they rode north toward Colorado and whatever awaited them there, Beau found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he'd been a drifter with nothing to lose and no one to care about. Now he had a family, a home, and a purpose that went beyond his own personal quest for revenge. Beside him, Maria rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. She'd insisted on bringing her Winchester rifle, a gift from Marshal Bradley, and Beau had seen her practicing with it behind the house. She was a natural shot, with the kind of steady nerves that couldn't be taught. "You know there's no guarantee." "We'll find them alive," he said as they crested a hill that gave them their last view of Rosario. "I know," she replied, "but we have to try. Some fights are worth having, even if you might not win." Dusty tossed his head and picked up the pace, as if eager to begin this new adventure. Behind them, the canyon country faded into the morning. Haze, its red rocks holding their secrets and their memories. Ahead lay the mountains of Colorado, and whatever justice they could bring to Marcus Rowe and his Operation. The canyon's memory would always be with them, the place where they'd found each other, where a horse's intuition had led them to something precious that had been lost. But now they were writing a new chapter, one that would be measured not in what they'd survived, but in what they'd prevented. As the sun climbed higher and the desert gave way to rolling grassland, Beau McAllister rode toward his destiny with his niece at his side and his faithful horse beneath him. Behind them lay the peace they'd built from ashes, Ahead lay the fight that would define who they chose to become. The trail stretched endlessly before them, winding through country both beautiful and dangerous, toward a confrontation that would test everything they'd learned about courage, family, and the unbreakable bond between those who refused to let evil triumph over innocence. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the morning wind, came the sound of children's voices. Not cries of distress, but laughter and hope, the promise that some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost.